thank you everyone for joining us today, or if you're joining us when you were watching the recording. We're going to go ahead and jump into From Scraps to Soil, Composting Basics. I do want to emphasize this is about composting basics, so it's an overview of getting started with composting. We're not going to dig in too deep or technical with it, but it's a great way to get started. Before we get too much into it, I do have a handout that I can share with you. The link here is on the screen and in the chat. I'll just read it off here. It is go.wisc.edu / the lowercase v, the number 9, lowercase d, the numbers 346. So that handout is available and it has lots of resources about composting that you'll want to refer to as you get started on your composting journey here. So we all know the idea of reduce, reuse, and recycle, and I'm sure we're doing a stellar job of recycling. We know what to do with our cardboard and our plastic and our glass, right? We can apply these same concepts of reduce, reuse, and recycle to yard waste, like yard trimmings and food scraps. And by managing these organic materials at home, we can reduce waste, especially waste that is filling up landfills, and improve our yard at the same time. So the options to manage your yard waste is going to depend on where you are. You might have some community management programs or municipalities that can handle collecting and processing yard trimmings. However, this usually doesn't include food scraps. Another option is on-site management, so backyard composting. So we're going to focus on composting your food waste or food scraps and some of your yard waste. Food waste makes up 20% of the waste in Wisconsin's landfills, and that number has doubled since 2009. So before you embark on backyard composting, just check that you might have some local ordinances that regulate household composting activities. So check with your city or your township just to make sure. So what is compost? What we are doing with backyard composting is essentially speeding up the natural process of microbial decomposition of biodegradable materials. So the finished product is what is pictured here. It's this humus-rich substance. It's full of organic matter, it has nutrients, and it helps retain moisture. So this decomposition process, again, it's a natural process, but backyard composting can help speed it up. It is an aerobic process, so it means it needs oxygen. So in addition to helping manage your organic waste like food scraps and yard waste and reducing the amount of organic waste in the landfills, there are a lot of benefits to backyard composting. That finished compost from a pile is typically a more uniform product with a better balance of nutrients, and you have control over that compost. You have control of what's going into that compost pile. It's a great soil amendment that you can add to your soil and to your plantings. It improves soil health, improves the soil structure, increases organic matter. Compost helps retain moisture and helps improve drainage for all types of soil. So if you have sandy soil, add compost. If you have heavy clay soil like I do, add compost. It is great for all types of soil. And it increases the number and the types of the microbes in the soil, which actually helps plants obtain nutrients. It makes those nutrients more available. And there's lots of ways to use compost in the landscape. Just make sure you're using a finished or aged compost. We don't want to put fresh compost next to plants because that can cause problems, but you can incorporate this the finished aged compost. You can incorporate it into the soil before you plant. You can use it as a mulch in between plants. You can use it as a top dressing on lawns, use in your vegetable garden prior to planting, or as a side dressing or a mulch around the plants. Just a little word of caution here, if you are planting a tree, we don't want to backfill that hole with compost. Always use the original soil that you removed from the hole when you're planting a tree or a woody shrub. Okay, back to composting here. So when we think of a compost pile, we might imagine kind of this pile of food scraps and plant material. And even though we do some work with turning it and adding materials to the pile, the real work is done by the decomposer organisms. So there's microorganisms in there, and this is a collection of bacteria and fungi that are responsible for the most decomposition. They are the workers here. They actually change the chemistry of organic waste. They break down the plant materials so that the nutrients can be available for plants. And under proper conditions, that compost pile will heat up within days because the bacteria are consuming the organic materials. There are also macroorganisms. So these are the bigger things that we can see. You probably are familiar with pill bugs or sow bugs, earthworms and slugs and beetles and all sorts of other things that can live in that compost. And these are going to be really active in the later stages of the decomposition process. So your job when making compost is to provide the best possible environment for those beneficial organisms to do their work. And if you do that, the decomposition process works really quickly, sometimes in as little as 2 weeks. If you don't provide the optimum environment, that's okay. Decomposition will still happen. It just takes longer. Maybe it takes more weeks, maybe it takes months or even longer. So as a composter, you're going to balance these 4 things here. Organic material provides food for the organisms, and that's in the form of carbon and nitrogen. So bacteria use carbon for energy and protein to grow and reproduce. So we generally refer to these as the browns when we're adding material to the compost. And you can identify these high carbon plant materials or the browns because they're dry, they're tough, they're fibrous, and they're tan or brown in color. So like dry leaves, straw, shredded paper, corn stalks, those are all examples of carbon-rich materials. And you're going to want about 2 to 3 times as much carbon materials or browns to the nitrogen materials. Nitrogen is another source of food for our microorganisms that we're feeding in our compost. These high nitrogen materials also provide protein-rich components that they need to grow and multiply. So these are often referred to as the greens. These could be maybe freshly pulled weeds or untreated grass clippings, vegetable and fruit scraps and kitchen scraps, and other kind of moist green matter. Those are the source of nitrogen-rich materials you already have at home probably. But if you add too much nitrogen, too many greens, the pile releases excess nitrogen as smelly ammonia gas, and it also raises the pH, and that's all going to be toxic to the microorganisms that we're trying to have in there. And again, don't worry about trying to measure the exact ratio of carbon and nitrogen. If we just kind of follow a 2-to-1 rule, you'll be okay. You'll notice if decomposition slows down or if the pile gets smelly. So you'll know if something is a little out of whack and then be able to adjust it. The next thing really important to our microorganisms and the decomposition process is water. So moisture is really important for the composting. Too much moisture is going to drown those microorganisms. Too little will dehydrate them. So a general rule of thumb is just to keep the material in that compost pile as moist as a really well-wrung sponge. Add unchlorinated water. You could insert your garden hose into the pile, maybe in a few spots. You could just give it a sprinkle of water from your watering can when you water your plants or when you go and turn the pile. You can use an enclosed container or cover the pile with a tarp, and that can help maintain moisture levels. And oxygen. So we mentioned decomposition is an aerobic activity. So when your pile is first assembled, there's lots of spaces in there. There's air in between the layers of material, so there's lots of air. But as the microorganisms begin to work and they're consuming those things, they are going to use up that oxygen. And as the layers kind of compress, things can become compacted. There's less oxygen. So you need to aerate or turn the pile in some way. Without oxygen, the bacteria are going to die and decomposition will slow by 90%. And if anaerobic microbes take over, so ones that don't need oxygen, if they take over, they'll produce some organic acids and ammonia-like substances. So that's when the compost becomes really kind of stinky and actually contains unavailable nitrogen and can be toxic to plants. So there's some other factors here that affect the speed of composting. And just these 3: temperature, the size of the particles that are in the compost, and volume. So as the microorganisms work to decompose the compost, they give off heat, and that heats up that compost pile. So hot composting is when the temperature in the pile stays between 90 and 140 degrees. And that is when really rapid decomposition happens. Pile temperatures of about 130 can kill weed seeds and plant pathogens. So you might have heard of hot composting. That's what it means, is that You're maintaining a certain temperature, but this requires a lot more management from you. These hot compost piles, they need to be turned every week for 4 weeks, and then every other week for weeks or months after that. So you really have to be willing to actively work the materials. Alternatively, there's cool composting. And so you don't really worry about the temperature and you don't have to turn it as much. But because the compost might not reach those high temperatures, those weed seeds or maybe disease pathogens aren't going to be destroyed. So we're not going to want to add weeds and things like that to the pile. You can still turn it and add water, but if you're just kind of letting it cool compost and not as much turning, then it's just going to take longer to decompose. And that's certainly a very successful option for composting. Decomposition occurs faster if the materials are about a 1/2 inch in size. Not all the materials need to be super small because if you have everything really tiny, that will slow that air circulation. So you have a combination of larger and smaller pieces to kind of help create that structure in the compost. But what do you do with that large brush then? Maybe you have some large brush or branches as yard waste that just won't fit into the compost pile. What do you do with that? Well, you could spend some time cutting things down to a smaller size and being able to add them so they're smaller sticks instead of big branches. You could invest in a small chipper to have at your house. You could check with your municipality to see if there's any community waste materials programs. Or if you have space, you just create a separate pile, a separate brush kind of trimming pile that will decompose over time. And the volume. Decomposition is going to occur faster if the size of your pile or the size of your compost bin is 3 feet wide by 3 feet deep by 3 feet tall. Okay, this 1 cubic yard size really helps retain heat and moisture, but it's not too large that it's unwieldy to be managing for turning. If you want to have a big pile, then great, but maybe you need a tractor then to successfully turn it. So just keep that in mind. If you're not going to be turning it and it's a huge pile, then you're going to be cool composting and things will just take slower, and that's okay. So you kind of just take that in mind when you're considering the placement and construction of your compost area. So let's look at how to get started. To be successful, you just select a composting technique that suits your needs and lifestyle. There's a lot of different ways to compost. So as long as you provide those factors that we talked about, you're going to be successful. So the location, remember to check any local regulations pertaining to composting, just in case there's some rules in your area. But you're going to find a convenient location that gets some sunlight. 5 to 8 hours of sunlight would be great, but it doesn't have to be in direct sun. You need to be able to access it though. If it's way out of your way and you have to traipse through, the whole yard, a huge yard to get to it, you're not going to be using it. So the easier the compost is to get to, the more likely you are to stick with it. You want to be able to access it for adding materials, for turning, adding water when you need to, and keep it at least 3 feet away from buildings and away from your neighbor's window. Choose your container. You have lots of options when you're looking at these different types of container. And this is where you have more factors to think about. How much space do you have available? What you want the compost for and how soon you want to use that finished product? How much time do you want to spend managing it and how neat you want your compost pile or your container to look? So there's a wide variety of methods out there. You can build your own, you can purchase your own. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So one option is no container at all, just have a pile or a heap. And ideally, if you're just using a pile, just make sure to cover the food scraps with a layer of those brown materials or bury them in there. So the size of this heap is going to affect how you can actually turn it, if you turn it at all. Remember, you don't have to. The frequency of turning is going to affect how soon you have finished compost, because again, that turning is going to speed up the decomposition process. You can build or buy turning units. These are designed for frequent turning. So you might have seen this kind of 3-bin system here on the lower left. This is sort of like an assembly line. Compost is being moved into the subsequent bins during different stages of decomposition. There's barrel tumblers like this blue one here. You add materials to it and you keep turning. Make sure there's holes for air circulation in these types of turning units. And the compost should be ready in about 2 to 4 months. There's holding units. This is just a more passive way or more of a cool composting way. It's a really easy way to compost, but it's going to be slower and you're usually not turning it too much. So the stages of decomposition are going to vary from the top to the bottom. So you're adding materials to the top and things are decomposing so that the more finished compost is going to be found near the bottom of that pile or container. Again, you can construct these things on your own. You can purchase things. So really just keep in mind the maintenance, keep in mind these different containers and techniques really depend on how much effort you want to put into them, how soon you want results, and how you're going to use that finished compost. If you plan on turning it, you need to be able to get at it. If you're going to let it cool compost and let it be, you can do that too, although it still benefits from some turning. Okay, so you have your location, you have some sort of container or pile, and now you can add your materials. So remember that the microorganisms metabolize best with a diet of about 2 parts brown to 1 part green. So 2 parts carbon to 1 part green. And here are some examples of these materials. Again, in that resource document, there's lots of lists that you can refer to. So if you think about those browns, dry leaves and twigs, shredded newspaper, I ripped up a paper towel carton this morning to put in my compost. Your greens are the green juicy things, untreated grass clippings. We don't want to add any chemicals into our compost. Maybe coffee grounds and fruit and veggie scraps and eggshells and green leaves, okay? But what you want to really stay away from are the no-nos here. So no meat, no fish, no bones, and grease, oil, lard, all those things will really compromise your compost. Again, with the diseased infested plants, unless you're making sure that that compost is reaching 130 degrees, we don't want to add those. Keep the charcoal out of there because that has chemicals that are toxic to soil and plants. No pet waste, so no dog or kitty litter, things like that. And when you add the materials, make sure you kind of layer them up. You don't need to add any additives or accelerators. Sometimes you might see those. You can add some soil or some previous compost to help get things started. And managing, we talked about this already with making sure that there's oxygen and making sure that there's water. So if it dries out, those microorganisms aren't going to do their work. If it's too wet, they're going to suffocate, and we need air circulation in there. So you may need to do some regular turning or adding some coarser materials to kind of have that structure. And I'm going to say the W word, what happens in winter, and I know I shouldn't say that W word here, but it's kind of a question of what's going to happen to my compost in the winter. And essentially decomposition just slows down or stops. And if it's a small pile, it's going to freeze. And then when things start to thaw, it'll restart on its own. You can cover it with a tarp to help retain heat longer, but it isn't necessary. You really need a large amount of material or an insulated bin to maintain hot composting through the winter. So you can do that. You just need to insulate your compost bin, maybe with some hay or a bunch of leaves. You're going to avoid aerating it in the winter because then you'll lose heat. And be very careful about adding food scraps in the winter because you'll just end up with a soupy mess in spring and can attract a lot of pests. But if you had a stockpile of your browns, of your carbon sources like shredded leaves, or other kind of carbon materials, you can use those to bury the food scraps in the winter. So you could still add food scraps and then make sure you cover them. And compost is ready when it is dark, it's loose, it's crumbly, it smells a little sweet and earthy. It doesn't smell rotten. It's going to be a little fluffy. So it doesn't need to be powder. And it's going to be the same temperature as the air temperature. So if it still feels hot, then it's still working. It's still decomposing. So it needs some more time. If there's still some materials in there that are visible and maybe not all the way decomposed, you could always screen out, just like some hardware cloth or some window screen or like chicken wire. You can kind of screen it through and then put those materials back into the compost. And depending on your method, it could be ready in a few months or it may take longer. Again, we talked about those factors. If you aren't turning it on a regular basis and you don't know what temperature it's getting to, don't worry. The materials will eventually decompose. So most problems with compost is just because one of these things is out of whack, okay? We need to balance these different factors. I'll go through a couple of main problems, but if you're having a problem with your compost, it's likely that the size of materials are wrong or the amount of carbon or nitrogen is off. Maybe it's not getting enough air, maybe it's not getting enough moisture. If you have smelly compost, then it usually indicates one of these two things. So compost shouldn't smell. When you walk by a compost bin, it shouldn't stink. If it does, if it smells like vinegar or rotten eggs, it's probably too wet and there's not enough oxygen. So that needs to be turned, and we can add some of those coarse, dry materials. And maybe it's getting like a lot of rain on it, or probably not here during drought, but maybe it's next to something that maybe it's getting a lot of moisture and you could protect it from extra moisture. If it sort of smells bad like ammonia, then there's too much nitrogen in there and we need to add some of those carbon rich materials. Shredded newspaper works great, leaves, things like that. I know that pests can be an issue, so maybe if there's attracting rats or raccoons or that neighborhood dog, most of the time that's because there's inappropriate food scraps in there. So there's meat in there or fat or bones. So definitely avoid the no-nos and bury any other food scraps in there. You can take measures to prevent rats or rodents if that's a problem in your area. You could use a rodent resistant bin. You could use hardware cloth to help. You can definitely take some measures to prevent or discourage rodents or other critters getting into the bin if this is a problem. Definitely keeping the pile turned so that it is active and composting so that they don't try to find some nice warm dry area to nest in. And if you have a lot of insects, maybe a lot of flies, or you see other insects, that's what it's supposed to be doing. That's a good sign. But maybe if it has too many flies or they're just becoming a nuisance, again, add some soil or leaves over your food scraps. And if you're worried about slugs being in there and getting into a neighboring garden, you can use traps or barriers to help with that. Of course, there are lots of ways to make compost. We just kind of gave an overview of how to get started with a very sort of classic or traditional way of having a compost pile or using some sort of bin or container. Find the way that works for you and your lifestyle and your situation, because everyone has a different situation. Worm composting might be another method, but do your research and you can recycle those food scraps and your yard waste. And we have that link to the handout. I'll put that up one more time and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, Julie. We have, as you can guess, lots of questions to get us started. I'd like to start with one that has come up a couple different times in the question box. What about weeds? And when we say weeds, we could say those that we pull from our vegetable gardens, or maybe something that we might consider even an invasive weed. What are the things that we should be thinking about? Are there concerns? What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So you could put weeds into the compost pile before they go to seed. The concern with putting any weed into the compost pile is if it's in seed, or then those seeds aren't going to die in the compost unless that compost is at 130 degrees for a while. So you have to maintain hot composting. So that again is a really active and involved composting method. So if it's an invasive weed and it's gone to seed especially, you can bag those up and send them to the landfill. I know we're trying to reduce waste, but in some situations where we need to get rid of weeds, you may need to bag them up and send those to the landfill. When I'm weeding my garden, I personally, and I'm not just like the regular weeds, not some very invasive weed I'm trying to destroy, but just regular weeding, I have a separate pile. I don't put them in my food scrap compost. I have a separate pile where all that stuff goes, and it still decomposes over time. That pile gets smaller throughout the year, and every year I add to it. So I don't use that compost product then. I have space for a separate pile.
And one more I'll just throw in that's related to that. There's a couple questions about checking the temperature of our compost piles. And I feel like you've touched on that in terms of just how much do we want to manage? And it's also related to the answer that you just gave. Would you maybe just summarize, should we have a thermometer and be out there checking? What would be the pros and cons of that?
Right. And that's up to you. You can get a compost thermometer and that will help you track the temperatures within the pile. And that, the pile's temperature continues to increase as those microorganisms are metabolizing the materials in there. In the center of a pile, it can reach 135 to 160 degrees pretty quickly. So you could be, but you don't have to. So if you really want to, get involved with your compost, you could certainly be checking the temperature and make sure you're maintaining that. But it does need to be, let's see, mature compost needs to be at an internal temperature of 105 degrees or higher for 5 consecutive days. If you are trying to eliminate those weed seeds, it should exceed 130 degrees for at least 4 hours. So again, you can do that, but you don't have to.
All right, Julie, I would like to take this in another direction. We have a few questions coming in, just generally on how long compost lasts. One listener has compost that's been sitting for about 3 years. Another listener is moving and wants to take their compost with them to a new location, but aren't going to be using it immediately. So how long can we be holding on to this material?
I would say you can still use that finished compost no matter how old it is. It's not gonna probably have the microorganisms in it, and the nutrients are gonna have leached out. So it's probably, as it ages, it's not going to have as much of all those things, but it's still gonna be helpful. It's still gonna have organic matter. I just probably not as high as nutrient levels if you were to compare it to something that was, you know, done a little bit earlier.
All right, let's go with, we only have a couple minutes left. So lots of people are interested in some real specific things that should or shouldn't go in the compost pile. And I know you showed us one of your slides showed that, but real quickly on a couple things. Pine needles, I don't remember seeing that on the slide. What about pine needles?
Yeah, pine needles can go in there. I wouldn't add them all at once, maybe. You could certainly add them. I'll get to this here. If I had any other information on pine needles, they're just going to be slow to decompose. Just make sure you're mixing them thoroughly with other materials. So don't add like a whole, all pine needles, but if you had kind of a pile of them and you're just kind of adding them whenever you add stuff and mixing them in, that's fine. I just wouldn't add a huge like wheelbarrow full of them at once.
And that would be under the brown carbon category.
Yeah, pine needles are going to be carbon, right?
All right, another one along those same lines. What about adding, we always hear eggshells, we hear coffee grounds.
Both are great. Avoid whole eggs, but you can add eggshells, and coffee grounds are great too. Coffee grounds, that's going to fall under your greens. Any kind of food related things are your greens.
I'll jump in with one more while Maddie's finding a question. We also had, what about adding vermiculite or perlite? Something that we might not find as our waste, but what about that? Does it help the compost? Is it not really necessary and would just be an added expense? What's your take on that?
I wouldn't add it. Perlite and vermiculite are usually added to like potting mixes to help with to help with the moisture in the soil, but I wouldn't be spending money to add that to my compost. I'm going to use the material that I already have.
All right.
Okay, and I have just maybe one last question here since we're at 12:30, but some folks are wondering if you can grow things in compost. Well, someone asked if it was okay to add onions, but I interpreted that as, can you plant stuff directly in compost and will it grow?
Well, I have a squash plant growing out of my compost bin right now, but typically, so things could be growing out of it like that, but it could affect germination of seeds, and if it's we want to make sure that it is aged compost so that it's finished, so that it doesn't burn anything, because again, compost can heat up and those materials haven't broken down yet. So the decomposition process, those microorganisms are changing the chemical composition. So if you're trying to plant things in fresh compost, I wouldn't recommend that. If you're using like finished compost that has sat, yes, you can plant in that. But you're not going to plant, something into fresh compost that still needs to decompose.
All right, thank you so much, Julie. That